Most people know his name for exactly one reason. He is the man who buried Jesus. That's it. That's the entire summary that most Christians carry with them. A man appeared after the crucifixion, asked for the body, placed it in a tomb, and disappeared from the biblical narrative as quickly as he had entered it. But that summary misses everything that actually happened. Because what Joseph of Arimathea did on that Friday afternoon was not a quiet, private act of charity. It was a public declaration that landed like a thunderclap over Jerusalem. It was a decision made in real time, under maximum pressure, in full view of the people who had the power to destroy him. And it cost him more than most people will ever understand. This is the story of what Joseph gave up and why he did it anyway. Jerusalem, Friday, approximately 3 in the afternoon. Jesus was dead. The crowd that had gathered at Golgotha was thinning. The soldiers were still there, finishing their work. 2 other men had been crucified alongside Jesus, and Roman protocol required that the bodies be dealt with before the Sabbath began at sundown. In Jewish law, a body left on a cross overnight brought defilement on the land. In Roman custom, crucified criminals were typically left on display, sometimes for days, as a warning to others.
I ask permission.
What happened next required someone to cut through both systems simultaneously. Someone with influence, someone with access, someone who could walk into the Roman governor's private quarters and make a request that most citizens of Jerusalem could never even attempt. And somewhere in that city, as the afternoon light shifted gold over the limestone hills, Joseph of Arimathea made a decision. He was going to ask for the body. To understand what that decision meant, you need to understand who Joseph was. The Gospel of Mark calls him a prominent member of the council. Luke calls him a good and righteous man who had not consented to the decision of the Sanhedrin. Matthew calls him a rich man and a disciple of Jesus. John adds one more detail that changes everything. John calls him a secret disciple. Secret, because he was afraid of the Jewish leaders. Joseph of Arimathea was not a fringe figure. He was not someone operating on the edges of society who had little to lose. He sat on the Sanhedrin, the supreme governing council of the Jewish people. He was wealthy enough to have carved a personal tomb out of solid rock in a garden near Jerusalem, which in the first century was the kind of real estate investment that only the extremely affluent could afford. He had spent decades building a life of influence, respect, and religious authority. He was exactly the kind of man that the system rewarded and protected, as long as the system could count on his loyalty. The moment he walked toward Pilate's praetorium that Friday afternoon, that loyalty was over. He knew it. He walked toward Pilate anyway. The meeting with Pilate was not a formality. Pontius Pilate had just spent the better part of Friday morning being pressured by the Sanhedrin into executing a man he personally believed to be innocent. He had washed his hands in front of the crowd, a public gesture that fooled no one, least of all himself. He was irritable, politically exposed. And now a member of the very council that had pushed him into the crucifixion was standing in front of him asking for the body. Mark records that Pilate was surprised that Jesus was already dead. Crucifixion was designed to be slow. It typically took days. That Jesus had died in 6 hours was unusual enough that Pilate summoned the centurion in charge to confirm it before granting the request. Think about what Joseph was doing while he waited for that confirmation. He was standing in the praetorium, the headquarters of Roman power in Jerusalem, publicly identifying himself as someone who cared about what happened to the body of a man the Roman governor had just executed as a criminal and a pretender to a throne. Every soldier who saw him there, every servant, every official, they all saw his face. They all knew who he was. There was no version of this where Joseph walked away anonymous. Pilate granted the request, and Joseph went to the cross. What he found there was not dignified. Crucifixion was designed to be the opposite of dignified. Roman authorities used it precisely because it was maximally humiliating. The body exposed, the death public, the suffering prolonged and on display. The man that Joseph had followed in secret, the man whose teachings had stirred something inside him that he could not name, was hanging on a Roman execution stake at the edge of the city. Joseph took him down. That act alone, the physical act of removing the body from the cross, carried enormous ritual weight. Under Jewish law, touching a corpse created ritual impurity that lasted 7 days. It required a specific purification process involving the ashes of a red heifer. It meant exclusion from the temple, from communal worship, from the Passover celebration that was beginning at sundown that very night. Joseph was a devout Jewish man. He understood exactly what he was taking on. He reached up and took the body of Jesus down from the cross anyway. Nicodemus was there too. He arrived carrying approximately 100 Roman pounds of myrrh and aloes, roughly 75 pounds by modern measure. The quantity was staggering. It was the kind of amount used for the burial of kings and high priests. It was a public, extravagant statement wrapped in spices and linen. Together, Joseph and Nicodemus did what the disciples could not bring themselves to do. What the women who had followed Jesus from Galilee watched from a distance. What 12 men who had walked with Jesus for 3 years were too afraid to attempt in broad daylight. They wrapped the body. They laid it in the spices. They carried Jesus through the garden to the new tomb that Joseph had prepared for himself. Stop there. That detail is easy to read past, and it should not be. Joseph gave Jesus his own tomb. This was not a spare room he wasn't using. In the 1st century, a rock-hewn tomb near Jerusalem was a long-term investment. It was where Joseph had planned to be buried, where his family would eventually rest. It represented continuity, legacy, and a permanent claim on the land near the Holy City. He gave it away on a Friday afternoon to a man the Sanhedrin had just executed. If you love biblical history told with this kind of depth, subscribe right now. Every week, we bring you stories that reveal the real human cost behind the events you think you already know. Now consider the full weight of what Joseph had done by the time the sun went down that Friday. He had publicly identified himself as a follower of Jesus to the Roman governor. He had touched the body of a crucified criminal, making himself ritually impure for 7 days. He had missed Passover, the most sacred night of the Jewish year. He had separated himself visibly and permanently from the decision of the Sanhedrin. He had donated his personal tomb to the man that council had condemned. And all of this happened in a single afternoon. The Sanhedrin would reconvene. The chief priests would meet. The conversations about what to do next would happen in rooms where Joseph had once sat as an equal. He would not be welcome in those rooms anymore. The social structure of Jerusalem's elite was small and tightly interconnected. Everyone knew everyone. Business relationships were inseparable from religious relationships. Legal authority, commercial influence, and spiritual standing were all woven together into a single fabric. Pull one thread, and the whole thing shifts. Joseph had not pulled one thread. He had cut straight through the center of it. There is a silence in the gospel accounts after the burial that is worth sitting with. Joseph of Arimathea is not mentioned in any resurrection appearance. He is not listed among those who ran to the empty tomb on Sunday morning. He is not in the upper room. He is not named at Pentecost. Some historians have interpreted this silence as evidence that Joseph pulled back after the burial, that perhaps the cost proved too high, that perhaps he retreated into private faith once the initial act of courage was complete. But there is another way to read that silence. The early Christian communities that preserved the Gospels were careful about protecting the identities of people who remained in vulnerable positions. Nicodemus disappears from the text too. So do many figures whose association with Jesus would have made them targets of ongoing persecution from the Sanhedrin. Silence in the text does not mean absence from the story. What we know is what he did. And what he did, no one else did. Early Christian tradition, preserved in texts outside the canonical Gospels, tells a more complete story of what happened to Joseph after the resurrection. In the tradition recorded in sources referenced by early church writers, Joseph was arrested by the Jewish authorities shortly after the resurrection. The empty tomb had created a crisis for the Sanhedrin, and Joseph was the most visible person connected to the burial. He was the one who had provided the tomb. He was the one whose name Pilate knew. He was the most exposed. According to these accounts, Joseph was imprisoned. He was held while the authorities tried to determine how to handle the political fallout of a missing body and reports of a risen Jesus spreading through Jerusalem at dangerous speed. Then the accounts say something remarkable. They say he was released, that he testified openly about what he had witnessed, and that he spent the rest of his life as part of the growing Christian movement that was spreading outward from Jerusalem into the wider Roman world. One stream of tradition, strong in British Christianity, holds that Joseph eventually traveled as far as the British Isles, carrying the gospel to the westernmost edge of the known world. Whether or not that specific tradition is historically verifiable, the theological weight of the whole story is clear. Joseph started in secret. He ended in the open. There is a question underneath this entire story that deserves to be asked directly. What made Joseph move? He had been a secret disciple for some time before that Friday. He had sat in Sanhedrin meetings where Jesus was discussed with hostility. He had heard the arguments. He had watched the machinery of religious power turn against one man. And through all of it, he had stayed quiet. Then Jesus died, and something cracked open inside him. Perhaps it was the moment of death itself, the realization that silence was now permanent unless he chose otherwise. That if he did not act in the next few hours, the body of the man he had followed in secret would be disposed of like a criminal, and he would have to live the rest of his life knowing he had done nothing. Perhaps it was simpler than that. Perhaps in the grief of that afternoon, the calculation just stopped making sense. Perhaps he looked at what he was protecting, his position, his reputation, his seat at the table, and for the first time it seemed small against what he had just watched happen. Whatever moved him, it moved him fast. There was no long deliberation, no consulting with allies, no waiting to see how things developed. He went directly to Pilate. He asked for the body, he brought it down from the cross himself, and he laid it in his own tomb. 2,000 years later, the name Joseph of Arimathea is remembered for that single act. Not for his years on the Sanhedrin, not for his wealth or his influence or his standing in Jerusalem society. Not for the decade of careful, quiet reputation building that preceded that Friday afternoon. For a tomb, and a decision made before sundown. History has a habit of collapsing our entire lives into our defining moments. For Joseph, the defining moment came at the worst possible time, on the day when Jesus was dead, when the movement seemed finished, when every rational voice would have said, "It's over. Stay home. Protect what you have." He did not stay home. He gathered his linen and his spices and his courage, and he walked toward the cross when everyone else was walking away. That is the story, not the burial, the walking toward. Before I let you go, I want to ask you something. Joseph of Arimathea was a secret disciple for a long time before that Friday. Many of us know exactly what that feels like, believing something privately that we're not ready to say out loud. So here's the question I want you to sit with. What would it take for you to walk toward the cross in your own life, publicly, at personal cost, in front of people who have the power to take things away from you? Write your answer in the comments. I read every single one. And I think you will find, when you read what others leave there, that you are not as alone in that question as you might think.